Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Looks like some who are over in the other application have moved over now, so that's great. It did ask a couple of questions on the bottom left for you to complete, and this is helpful for me just to kind of get an idea of what your skill level is and how comfortable you are with IMA at the moment. Okay. So today we are covering day 1 of IMA for beginners. That includes IMA Basics and Terminology. I am recording today's webinar, and I will be sending out the video link to those who are attending. It probably will not be today. It will be later this week. Since we're working with the new application, I'm trying to get familiar with making those files with this new program, and I'm having some computer issues, so it will be later this week when I send out the video links. But for the PowerPoint, I did send those out this morning, and if you didn't receive those, over on the right-hand side, you can see there's a Files for Download pod, and all 4 of the PowerPoint files are going to be located here. So you can click any of those and then click Download Files, and you can download those directly from this webinar. Also, I want to point out below that there is a chat pod. So you can submit questions at any time through this. It works so much better than the previous application we were using. This is actually the first time we're doing this series in this new webinar application. So I'm excited about that. We just used it for the first time last week, period. So this is the first time for the IMA for Beginners series. So I think it's going to be very useful with the new features that it has. At the very top, you will see a man icon with his hand raised. And if you click that down arrow, you'll see there's several options. So if you have a question if you have a question, first off, I'd like for you to put that in the chat pod. But then if you're having trouble hearing me if I'm not speaking loud enough, you can use these icons here, or if you need me to slow down. If you're struggling with something, you can raise your hand. Or I may ask you to raise your hand if you're familiar with something specific when I ask a question. So I just wanted to point those different icons out to you as well. So just some quick webinar etiquette. If you could please put yourself in Do Not Disturb status on all messaging apps and close all email applications until the session is over. That will ensure that you get the most out of the session that you can. Also, please note that through the phone, I have all participants muted. So please use the chat pod to ask any questions. At the end of the presentation, I'll re-enter interactive talk mode for any final questions that you can ask over the phone at that point. So just a quick note about me, since you're going to be listening to me talk a lot over the next 4 days. My name is Mona, and I'm the Instructional Design and Training Manager for the Vendor and Item Support Team. I own a cat named Tofu and a blind dog named Chloe, and I have 3 adorable nephews there in the center, and I love to travel. So like I said, today we are covering IMA Basics and Terminology. Tomorrow we'll be covering setting up new items in the new item grid. On day 3, Wednesday, we're going to be covering some different IMA features that you may or may not be familiar with. And then on day 4, we're covering maintenance in IMA. So we're going to go have a lot of demos with specific maintenance updates that you might need to do. So the purpose of today's session is to introduce you to basic IMA Basics and Terminology. And after completing this session, you will be able to explain the IMA workflow process and basic role responsibilities, explain IMA Basics and Terminology relevant to vendors, and identify the components of an item in IMA. So we're going to be covering an introduction, the workflow process, item components, and then terminology of those components. First off, what is IMA? IMA stands for Item Maintenance Application, and it's basically a new item build database. So anything that's being sold in our stores, if it's being sold in Kmart, in Sears, online, it has to be built in this system. It's basically a library of information of all product that we sell. We cannot get it to the stores. We can't ring it up at the registers. It won't pull on any reports, nothing until it's built within IMA. And IMA is a role-based application, so that means there are specific roles with specific responsibilities, and it has to go through in a certain path. We're going to be covering that in just a few slides. So IMA is not the order creation system. Inventory does not go into IMA to create orders. They use information from IMA in other systems to create orders, but those aren't done within IMA itself. Also, IMA does not feed every downstream system. So we have a lot of systems at SHC that we use internally, but everything starts with IMA. But as far as maintenance, sometimes when you do a maintenance or a change request in IMA, it's not going to feed to all those downstream systems, so sometimes they also have to be done in other applications. So there are several methods of entry. And over on the right side, you will now see a question. It asks, do you use a data catalog provider? So go ahead and take a second and answer that question for me, please. So data catalog is the main point of entry for our vendors. We do require all new vendors to use data catalog. If a vendor's been around with us for a really long time, they maybe have never made that transition. But if it is a new vendor, we do require it. The main exceptions would be dependent on the type of cartons that you're building. If you are building assorted or mixed cartons or pallet packages, those cannot be synced over, and they do have to be built manually. So otherwise, you should be using a data sync provider. So it looks like I only have 4 responses so far. I'll go ahead and broadcast those. So the 2 that don't know, if you don't know if you use a data sync provider, I would recommend that you talk with someone else from your group. I'm guessing that maybe you're an existing vendor and maybe you're taking over these IMA responsibilities. If that's the case, you probably have a data sync provider that you use. And then depending on the company that you're in, some vendors will have the same person do IMA that does the data catalog, whereas other vendors may have completely different people doing those processes. So that's something that you're going to have to find out from your company and how that's handled. Some other methods of entry that we have for merchants and inventory, we have a spreadsheet upload. We also have, it's an application called CMA, the cost model application. Sometimes, especially for imports, they will start that process within CMA, but even for some domestics, they will as well. And then most of our merchants and inventory analysts here do manual processing. And then finally, we have spend. If an item is going to be exclusively online, then that actually gets created in spend, and then it's going to backfeed into IMA. Now, if your buying teams work with spend and you have questions about spend, then you will need to reach out to them. I actually have nothing to do with spend, so that's something that you would have to reach out to your merchant teams for. All right, so there's a lot of different information that's put into IMA. We're going to be going over a lot of this morning, but much of this information can also come over from the data sync provider, which really cuts down on your setup time. Okay, first we're going to talk about the workflow and ownership within IMA. So the item setup process always starts with the vendor. You will initiate the item setup in IMA, and you do that by using your data sync provider to sync information over. Once that information gets synced over, you can locate it in your new item task list and then take those into a new item grid and work those through. If you don't use data sync, if you build cartons that can't be synced over, then you would just do that process manually, and then once it's approved, it goes into the merchant role. The merchant then validates some of your entries, and they add some specific merchant and IST specific fields, such as the retail price, the core item number for your Sears items, and some additional fields that pertain just to them. After your merchant approves it, it goes to your inventory analyst. They validate vital information such as the tier group. That really determines how that item is getting to our stores and ultimately to the customer. They also add inventory-specific fields. From there, it goes to supply chain. Supply chain validates that the merchandise is shipping through the most cost-effective DC tier for DC items and includes transportation logistics and return logistics. Now, so far, all of these 4 roles have been manual. The only real kind of exception to that is supply chain. It's a partially manual role, partially automated. Now, what that means is if something comes through supply chain, like maybe a very small box, but it weighs 60 pounds, something like that would get flagged, and it would actually have to be reviewed by a person. So that's where the manual part comes in for the supply chain role. Once it goes through all of these 4 rows, it then goes to the just system automated roles. First one of those would be hold state. It's running a set of checks on your items. So if you've done quick searches for your items to try to see if it's operational yet, you very likely have seen that it's in hold state. Now, when it's in hold state, that doesn't mean that you should automatically just reach out to IMA help or reach out to your merchant team. Be patient. Give it a little bit of time. It's usually going to be in there for at least a couple of hours, sometimes overnight. Now, if you come back the next day and you check and it's still in hold state, then there's something wrong with it. Something is holding that up, and that's when you would reach out to IMA help. So once it gets out of the hold state, it's going to go to the bridging role. This is where a second set of checks is run on the items. Now, if your items are Kmart items, they're going to pass through bridging super fast and go straight to operational. If your items are Sears items, then it's going to stay in bridging for a bit. We do have a we have a legacy item setup system for Sears called Core. It was around before Sears and Kmart combined, and it still exists today. To kind of mesh all of our systems together when we combined Sears and Kmart, they created the Core item tab within IMA, and during the bridging process, everything on that Core tab gets pushed to the Core system. So that's why your Sears items are going to be in bridging for a while. It could just be a couple of hours, or again, it could be overnight. But finally, your items are going to be operational. Once they are operational, then orders can be created for those items, and we can get those to our customers. So there is a video link that goes through the workflow process. I included it here on the PDF. Feel free to view that later today after the session. It is in the PDF that I sent out to you guys, and it's available for download. So any questions so far? All right, I got a quick knowledge check. Oh, I see Nikki's asking a question. While she's typing out her question, there is a knowledge check over on the right side. True or false, items will be available for ordering immediately after I approve them through the vendor role. So if you could take some time to go ahead and answer that, and then I will look at Nikki's question once she gets that typed. All right, Nikki's asking, what is the only instances that you do not use the data catalog? So you should really only not use data catalog if you are building specific types of cartons that can't be synced over. In a little bit, we're going to be going over all of the types of cartons that you can create within IMA. Several of those can be synced over, but the mixed and assorted cartons cannot be synced over. And if you build pallets in the system, those cannot be synced over. So those would have to be built manually. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the pallet side of it as well, because you don't have to build them in the system necessarily. So we'll be getting into that. But again, if it's mixed, assorted, or pallets, those have to be built manually. Otherwise, everybody should be using the data sync provider. Okay, so taking a look back at this question, items will be available for ordering immediately after I approve them in the vendor role. Go ahead and end that. So that is actually false. Items are not available for ordering immediately after you approve them because it has to go through all of those other roles before it can be operational. It has to go through vendor, merchant, inventory, supply chain, hold state, bridging, and then finally, once it's operational, it's going to be available to the ordering systems. So that's why communications with your merchant and inventory teams is really important, especially if items are being passed back and forth, if they're being returned and pushed back through. Then you always want to let them know that you've pushed something back through if they returned it to you, so they can go ahead and get that to operational and get it ordered. All right, any more questions so far on the workflow? Okay. We're going to move on to item components. So when you build an item within IMA, let's say you're going to build a water bottle, a reusable water bottle, we may refer to that as a general piece of merchandise or an item. But that item that's getting built within IMA has several pieces or components to it. Not to be confusing, but one of those components is actually called item as well. So when someone's referring to an item, they could be referring to the general piece of merchandise, or they could be referring to that specific piece of that general item. Some additional components of the item would be KSN, packages, vendor packs, and core item. Now each of these components have a tab within IMA, and then on each of those tabs you will find specific information. So the view that we're currently looking at, this would be if you did a quick search for an item and then you clicked into the tabs that way. When you're doing the new item setup grid, it looks pretty different. We're going to be covering that tomorrow, but this would be more if you're just doing a quick search. Maybe you're researching an item or just double checking information on an item. Okay, so the first item component that we're going to talk about is item. Item describes the business unit that your product is assigned to. So it identifies the division, the category, and the subcategory. I know it's not listed, but that's optional more for you guys. An item shares the same store location, and it shares the same selling price. It's a 9-digit number, and typically you'll find that it's identical to the KSN for Sears items. Item number for Kmart items may differ from the KSN number due to a process that's called linking. And I only mention this because usually when vendors think of linking, they're thinking of something very different than what the process actually is within IMA. It's referred to as linking. Linking is done only by inventory, and it's done for replacing items. So if you have maybe a product and there's basically the same product with maybe different packaging coming through to replace it, then they would link that so that it goes to the same store location and shows up the same on reporting. So that's an example where something would be linked. But again, that's an inventory-only process. It's not something that vendors do. So I know vendors seem to think that it's just adding UPCs to an item, but that's not actually what we refer to as linking. So as an example, we have water bottles. The SHC hierarchy, that division, category, and subcategory, it tells you the location of your item within the store. So we know that this water bottle is going to be in the sporting goods department. We know it's going to be with all of the other accessories. And then finally, we know specifically it's going to be with all the other water bottles within the sporting goods accessories. So this is your SHC hierarchy. Now, by a show of hands up at the top, how many of you do Sears items? Anybody else? Okay, so if you do Sears items, you may also hear your buying team or inventory team references Sears hierarchy. That can have a Sears division, and you also have an SHC division. And so usually these divisions are going to be different numbers because there's about 5% of the time where they may be the same number, but usually they're going to be different. So I say that to say that if you're having communications with your buying team and maybe they're telling you what the hierarchy setup should be for when you do your new items, and they tell you a division number that you don't have access to, I would maybe double check with them and see if they gave you the Sears division. Because when you're setting up your new grid and you select that hierarchy, you are selecting the SHC division. So you can always double check with your merchant team and just get some clarification as far as which hierarchy they're referring to. When you're in IMA, you're going to be working with the SHC hierarchy. All right, so item types. There are two main item types. The two most common ones are typicals, also referred to as each or member, and exploding assortments, also referred to as X's. So typicals are what's actually being rung up at the register. So it could be a 6-pack of soda because it's rung up as a 6-pack, or maybe a bottle of shampoo or a single shirt. Exploding assortments do not get rung up at the registers, so it's just an assortment of items. And those are the two most common ones. It's probably, your buyer is probably having you build those. Less commonly, we have a supply fixture. We also have class control, and the best example of that would be curtains. Because there's such a wide variance of lengths and widths for curtains, we put them all on the same item as a class control item. Because inventory only cares about how many curtains they're selling. They don't care about all those different variances. Supply items, anything that's being supplied at the store, such as paper towels, plastic bags, cleaning supplies. And then installation agreements and protection agreements. So if any of you work in maybe hard lines, if you're a hard lines vendor, you supply maybe washers, dryers, refrigerators, those all have installation agreements and protection agreements that we offer. And they are flagged on those items, but they also have to actually be built as an item itself so we can ring them up at our registers. All right, vendor relevant fields for item. You have your item type. You have the SHC hierarchy, that division, category, and subcategory. You have your EAS tag required indicator. That is the security tag that goes on your items. You may sometimes clothing will have that, or maybe if you work in tools and you're supplying a really expensive drill, something like that may have an EAS tag or the security tag. And then finally, default selling price. So the default selling price is not required for you to enter. A lot of vendors like to enter this, so that's why we have it listed. But this will typically be updated by the merchant. So when you go into single edit, so again, you do a quick search for an item, and then you click that item tab, this is what you may see. Okay, so up here you have your item type. This is your SHC hierarchy. Below that, you see your EAS tag required indicator. Let me see if I can get a, there we go. Now I have a mouse. So this is your SHC hierarchy. This is your EAS tag required indicator. And then over here, you can see your default selling price. So any questions about the item component? Okay, we're going to move on to the KSN. KSN stands for Key Stock Number. It's a 9-digit number assigned by IMA during the initial creation process. It's completely random. However, even though it's the 9-digit number, you may often only see 7 digits displayed. That is because this dash and check digit is usually omitted. So if you try to do a quick search for an item and you have that dash, you do have to omit that in most cases. Most of the reporting that you see will also have this omitted. Additionally, if it has a 0 at the front, that can be left off. So that's why you would only see 7 digits in some instances. The KSN may identify the style, size, color, fabric, or information on merchandising strategies. It's used primarily by inventory to monitor sales and order creation. So just to call out, SHC references the KSN more than the UPC since it's used to track sales and ordering. Now I know you as the vendor are used to referencing your items using that UPC or that G10. So that's one of the things I like to call out. I call it out to merchants and inventory as well, just so that if there is some miscommunication between you guys and let's say maybe you're just not sure what they're referring to, which items they're referring to, you can maybe start referring to your items using the KSN instead of the G10, or ask them to refer to it using the G10. Sometimes that can clear up some of that communication. So vendor relevant fields in the KSN, basically it's just your KSN number and your KSN description. So when you're setting up your items and you enter your description, it will sync over the vendor description and KSN description. You don't have to enter that separately. And then up here at the very top, you will see your KSN number. So any questions about the KSN component? Okay, then we're going to move on to packages. So packages contain information on boxes or shipments of product sent to an SHC store. So it can identify dimensions and weights, brand, hazardous information, country of origin, HTS code, fabric metal content. You own almost everything on the packages tab. Now first we're going to talk about the types of packages. There are 3 types of packages. You have each packages, you have cartons, and then you have pallets. So each packages are what's being sold in the store. Each item must have a corresponding each package. So you remember we talked about the item types a few slides ago, and that the most common ones are typicals, which are eaches, or exploding assortments. So each item has to have a corresponding each package. And then carton and pallet creation is dependent on each packages. If you haven't built eaches, then you don't have anything to put into your cartons and pallets. So since the eaches are what's sold in the store, they get that UPC, the retail marking number, which is also known as your RG10. Now in most instances, this is going to be a 12-digit number. There's a few divisions where this is slightly different, but for most people this will be that 12-digit UPC. So there are several carton types. Carton types include each cartons, uniform cartons, exploding assortment cartons, mixed and assorted carton, and sellable carton. Now the 3 most common kind are going to be each cartons, uniform cartons, and exploding assortment cartons. Those are the 3 that are used the most. Those are the ones that can also be data synced over. Then we have mixed and assorted, and then sellable cartons. Those cannot be data synced over. And then next we'll be talking about pallets, which also cannot be data synced. But all of your cartons get that shipping marking number. It's a 14-digit number. It's also known as your SG10, your I-205, or your G1014 barcode. So each cartons are really large items, such as refrigerators or washers and dryers. They are sold in the same box that they're being shipped in. Since they're being sold in the same box they're being shipped in, they have to have both a retail marking number and a shipping marking number. A uniform carton is multiple eaches in specific quantities. So you could have 12 bottles of water, or 12 water bottles, or 24 of the same exact size and color shirt. An exploding assortment is an assortment of items. So for apparel, for example, you could have 2 smalls, 4 mediums, and 4 larges. In this example, this is for batteries. It has 9 volts, C batteries, AA's, D's, and AAA batteries. This is what it looks like in the system. If you do a quick search and click on the package tab and then click into that carton number, you can see the KSNs that are in the carton, and you can see the UPC that belongs to each KSN, and you can see the quantity. Oops, I forget to move the green arrow. There we go. So again, these are your KSNs, Each KSN has a specific UPC, and then you can see a specific quantity for each UPC. All right, so mixed and assorted cartons. So typically, these are used for Kmart items. To be more specific, it has to be used for items going through the Kmart ordering system. So technically, we do have some Sears items that use the Kmart ordering system. So there are some Sears items that could be built as a mixed and assorted carton, but it's not very common. So if your buyer is asking you to do this, I would just double check that this is what they really want. Everything in a mixed and assorted carton has to have the same cost and selling price, and it's important to note that sales and inventory cannot be tracked for the individual UPCs. So for a mixed carton, that is one KSN with fixed quantities of multiple UPCs. And for an assorted carton, that's one KSN with unknown quantities of multiple UPCs. I'm sure that's clear as mud, so we're going to get into that a little bit more and explain that. And also, just one more call out, again, these cannot be data synced. They do have to be built manually. All right, so this is a mixed carton example. So we may order 24 bottles of bubble bath, specifically 8 peach, 8 vanilla, and 8 orange. So we know exactly what we're going to get from you. Once it gets to the store, we cannot track it at the scent level. So we don't know how many peaches, vanillas, or oranges we're selling. We only know how many total bottles of bubble bath we're selling. That's the limitations of a mixed carton. So here, you can see what this looks like. First off, under package type, it says mixed carton. Under KSN, it's the same KSN all the way down, just one KSN. And then there's multiple UPCs, and then each UPC does have a specific quantity. So again, we know exactly what we're ordering and what we're going to get, but once it gets to us, we can only see it at the KSN level, or at that bottle of shampoo, or I think it was bubble bath level. So assorted carton was unknown quantities of multiple UPCs. So this is used a lot with toys. One example that's used often would be Ninja Turtle figurines, or any type of figurines. But I like to use Ninja Turtles as an example because I loved Ninja Turtles when I was a little kid. So let's say we're ordering an assorted carton of Ninja Turtle figurines. We may only know that we're going to get a total of 20, but we don't know how many of each specific one we're getting. Let me show you what that looks like within IMA. So here, again, you do have a single KSN. You have multiple UPCs. But if you look over at each quantity, it's blank. It's empty. We do have a total eaches. So if, again, you would know the total number of the figurines that we're going to get, but we have no idea the specifics of what you're going to send us. And then once it starts being sold in our stores, we can only see how many figurines we're selling, not the specifics. So that's an assorted carton. And we also have a retail or sellable carton. It's a retail units that contain multiple retail units inside. This is most often done with oil or cigarettes. So the customer can either buy the carton or they can open up that carton and buy an individual unit. That's a retail or sellable carton. All right, now we're on to pallets. So just like mixed and assorted cartons, pallets cannot be data synced. It's typically just for Kmart items, or rather items going through the Kmart ordering system. There are two types of pallets. You have uniform pallets. You have exploding assortment pallets. Uniform pallets, just like uniform pallets, just like a uniform carton. Getting tongue-tied. Sorry about that. And an exploding assortment pallet is just like an exploding assortment carton. Now, what this means is that if you have Sears items and you want to ship them as a pallet, you can still do that. You just can't build them in the system as a pallet. So if you have Sears items, you could build that as a uniform carton or an exploding assortment carton. and then put them on a pallet when you go to ship them. So for an example with the uniform pallets, that could be bleach, potting soil, or fertilizer. An example of exploding assortment pallet would be back-to-school pallets containing notebooks, pencils, rulers, and highlighters, or maybe children's assorted sized underwear and t-shirts. All right, so I do have a question here on the right. Oh, wrong one. There we go, got the right one. All right, what are the 3 most common types of cartons? You could take a second and go ahead and answer that question for me. The 3 most common types of cartons. These are also the ones that can be data synced over. These are the ones that can be used with data sync. Just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And all right, so the 3 most common types of cartons are your exploding assortment, uniform, and each. So that very first choice is the correct answer. And again, those are the ones that can be data synced over. So if you're building those, which you most likely are, you would be using your data sync provider to build them. All right, so vendor relevant fields on the packages tab. We have our package type, the retail or shipping marking number, as well as the format, dimensions and weights, hazardous information, HTS codes, country of origin, fabric metal content, and package configuration. All right, so up here at the top, this is where you can see your package type. This is an example of an each package. You can see your retail marking number below that, and next to that's the format. Most of you will be the 12-digit format. Further down the page, you can see your dimensions and your weights. And then below that, you can see your hazardous questions. Now, it's really important that you complete these hazardous questions correctly. We did have a situation a couple years ago where this was not completed correctly for a vendor, and it actually ended up causing a fire on a plane. It was some sort of camping gas, and it wasn't marked as hazardous. It should have never gone on a plane, but it did because this was answered incorrectly. It did start a fire. Thankfully, nobody was injured. They were able to contain it. But that's why this information is really, really important. If you don't know the answers to this, please don't guess. Talk to someone from your company who knows the product and can answer these questions for you. So below that, we have HTS codes. Now, just by a show of hands, if you can raise your hand if you know what the HTS code is. Okay, so it's not surprising that most of you don't know. The HTS code, I think it stands for Harmonized Tariff Code, I believe. But basically, it's a code that it produces a description for the driver that's picking up your items. So if the driver comes and gets your items and he gets stopped by the police on the way to his location, he may be asked to produce a list of everything that's in the truck. And the HTS code is what produces this list for him. Now, as far as what's available with the HTS code, sometimes it's difficult to find an exact match. That's okay. Just find the closest match that you can. It doesn't have to be exact. below that, you will find your fabric metal content. So you do want to make sure that this is correct, especially if you are maybe an apparel vendor. You want to make sure that this is correct, so if there's an audit done on your factory and they're expecting to see that you use Egyptian cotton, they would expect that to be correct within IMA as well. And then to the left of that, you can see your country of origin. Now you can enter as many entries for this country of origin as you need to. So I know I've had some vendors where part of a product was made maybe in China and part of it was made in India, and you can put both of those here. I do caution you, if you're going to put U.S., please make sure your product's actually made in the U.S. All right, so this is an example of a carton package. Up here you can see that this is an exploding assortment carton. Down here we can see the configuration. So it's always good to make sure that this configuration is correct. Otherwise, your inventory may not be ordering what they think they're ordering. If you were supposed to build a carton with a configuration of, let's say, 3223, and you built it as 2112, then inventory would not be getting what they were expecting. Down here, you also see your dimensions and weights for your carton. So the dimensions and weights for your carton are not going to be the exact same thing as your eaches. It has to take into account the eaches that are going into it. And we will be talking some more about dimensions and weights right now, actually. All right, so dimensions and weights must align with GS1 standards on cube measurement. Cube is calculated by depth times width times height for both each and carton level. So we have an example here where each dimensions are 5 by 4 by 2. So the cube for that single each would be 40. And let's say that the weight of that single each is 5. So if there are 2 of those items in a carton, IMA will sum the each's cube and expect the carton cube to be equal to or greater than that sum. So in this example, again, the each's dimensions are 5 by 4 by 2, cube of 40. So at minimum, that carton cube sum would have to be at least 80. Now for the weights, the weight of that each is 5, and if there's 2, then the carton weight would be 10. Now if that cube sum is smaller than the minimum cube sum value, then you would get an error in IMA. You can be significantly greater. If it's grossly greater, if it's like way too much greater, then you would get an error as well. But there is a pretty big allowance in there. Now, if you get warnings with your dimensions and weights, those can be ignored. You only have to resolve errors. So I do have a little bit of a math problem for you. I tried to use simple numbers, so this should be something you can do in your head. If not, break out the calculator. There are 10 eaches in a uniform carton, and the dimensions of a single each is 10 by 6 by 4. So what is the minimum cube value for the uniform carton? So go ahead and take a minute or two and work that out. I'll leave the screen up on the left to assist with that. Wait just about 10 more seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And everybody got it right. So great job. So again, that lets you know what the minimum cube sum value is. And if it's smaller than that, again, you would get an error, but you do have an allowance going over it. So great job on that question. I know a lot of people get tied up with dimensions and weights. So I do want to call out that the carton dimensions must be correct, or there could be potential charges. So it's more important that the carton dimensions are correct than the eaches, because the carton dimensions is what lets us know how much space you're going to be taking up in the trucks. And what that does is, sorry, my computer's trying to restart on me, so it was coming up with a message, and I was trying to exit out. So, again, it lets us know how much space you're taking up in our truck. So if we send a truck to you and we're expecting you to take the entire space up, and you only take up half the space, that's kind of an issue because we could have planned that truck better to get more product in it. On the other hand, if we're expecting you to only take up half of the space and you end up taking up the entire truck, then again, that's going to be costing us money because we had scheduled that truck to stop elsewhere and get more product. So that's why the carton dimensions have to be correct. Otherwise, there may be potential charges. There are some exemption rules. So if items are compressed, stacked, or nested, or if it's packed within a shipper. So for example, if you have pillows, those can be compressed within a carton and take up less space than the minimum cube sum value. Same thing if you have chairs that are being stacked or nested within each other, those can qualify for the exemption rules. With weight, there are no exemptions. Carton weight must always align with your each's sum. So if exemption rules apply, you can change the dimension exception indicator flag to Y on all in-process items. It only has to be done on the eaches. It does not have to be done at the carton level. We will be discussing creating change requests for this on Thursday during the IMA maintenance session, and I'll walk through how to do a change request for that. So any questions about the packages? Okay, moving on to vendor packs. So an item cannot be ordered without a vendor pack. It identifies vendor-specific information, and basically it lets us know how to send your items. Some vendor-relevant fields, we have flow type, primary store format or ownership code, shipping package, total eaches per enter, number of enters, cost, vendor stock number and description, EAS tag. You may remember this was also on the item tab. The field is located on both the item tab and vendor pack tab, so just make sure that they coordinate together. California Prop 65 questions and ship points. All right, so up here at the top, this is ownership code, also known as store format. So you could be Sears or Kmart or both. If you always ship just Sears items or always ship just Kmart items, then you may not need to get that information from your merchant. But otherwise, basically, whenever you start building your items, you should be getting some information from your merchant. If you do items through both Kmart and Sears, that's a piece of information you may need from them. Another piece may be the flow type. So if you only ship one type of flow type ever, then that may not be something that you need to get from your merchant. But if you do sometimes do DC or DSD or JIT, you would need to know from your merchant what they're expecting. Now, if you go to select one and you don't have that option to select it, then that means that your DUNS number is not set up for that flow type accordingly, in which case you would have to go through part of the vendor onboarding to get that additional flow type added to your existing DUNS. Down below that, you can see your cost. This is the cost you agreed upon with your merchant. Vendor stock number and vendor description are below that. And then further down, you can see your vendor applied EAS tag and the EAS tag required indicator. Over to the right, you can see the California Prop 65 questions. So many of you are probably aware that California has some different laws regarding chemicals and items. Specifically, this is with PVC. So it'll ask you questions here, and you answer those about your items. And then at the very bottom of the page, you can see the ship point. This is where we're coming to pick up your item to get to our DCs. All right, so inners and eaches. I mentioned those. You can see those right here. Eaches for inner, number of inners. So inners are internal cartons within a carton. They may be broken down in the DC, and then the inners shipped to different stores. So in this example, we have 3 inners going into this carton, and there are 6 eaches for each inner. So the eaches per inner, number of inners. The total eaches would be 18. There are 18 Tylenol PM. The eaches per inner, there's 6 of them going inside of each one, so that would be 6. And the number of inners would be 3. Let's say you're just putting all of the product into one big carton. What would that look like? Well, here we have 18 total eaches. These are also now considered inners because there are no actual inners, so that would be 1 each per inner. And the number of inners would be 18. So if you have a carton of 12, then that would be 12, 1, 12. If you have a carton of 10, that would be 10, 1, 10. Whereas if you actually have inners in your carton, then it would look a little bit different than just the total quantity, 1, and total quantity. All right, so it looks like we're getting close on time, so I'm going to try to go through this a little quicker because we'll be coming back to this later this week. My merchant or inventory analyst has requested that I create a new vendor pack for an existing item. Why would I need to create a new vendor pack? There could be several reasons. It could be a new flow type. So if you've been shipping DC and your inventory wants the option of DSD, you would need to create a new vendor pack for that new flow type. Same thing with additional store format. If we've been selling your product in Sears and we want to start selling it in Kmart, it would need a new vendor pack. Different vendor. 2 different scenarios I can think of with this. Let's say vendor A has been supplying an item. They're going to stop supplying it, and vendor B is now going to start supplying it. They would need a new vendor pack. Another example would be the disposable water bottles, the big packages. We can't get that supply from a single vendor. We have multiple vendors supplying that. So every vendor that's supplying that same item would need their own vendor pack. Change in carton configurations, which can go along with new each or member. So if your carton configuration is going to change, or if you do get a new each or member, you would need a new vendor pack. And then finally, more than one cost. So typically, all your vendor packs have to be the same cost. There are some exceptions. So let's say that we've been selling your product in the stores in the 48 states, and now we want to start selling it in Hawaii or Alaska or maybe Puerto Rico. Those would require a different cost. The cost is going to be higher. So that means it needs its own vendor pack. So, and again, we're going to be coming back to new vendor packs on Thursday. So we'll be talking about this a little bit more at that time. So any questions on vendor packs so far? All right, we're going to move on to core item. We won't spend too much time on this. You guys don't actually do anything on the core item tab. It doesn't even exist when you create your item. It gets created by your merchants. However, if you are selling your items in a Sears store, the core item number is required for all items going through a Sears point of sale. So your merchant should be supplying that core item number to you. You then typically will tag your items with that core item number, possibly a SKU if it's a SKU'd item. And it's really important that that is correct. If that is not correct and it gets to the store, then we actually have to pull it off of the floor at the store, and then it takes 7 to 10 business days to fix an IMA behind the scenes. It's not something that's easy to fix. If it's still at your location and we haven't picked it up yet and the core item number is incorrect, Your buyer may decide to ask you to retag that. I know it takes time, so it's probably going to cost money. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you are getting the correct core item numbers from your merchant. Really, that's their responsibility, but I like to explain it to you so you know why it is so important. So any questions about the core item number? If you only do your items through Kmart, you never have to worry about the core item number. All right. Some key points to remember. IMA setup starts with the vendor. Items cannot be ordered until item setup in IMA has been completed. If you build each uniform or exploding assortment cartons, you should be using a data sync provider in the new item grid. If you have to build items manually and need assistance, please reach out to IMA help at searshc.com. And finally, your buyer should provide you with information to get started on your item build. And this will somewhat depend on how you typically build your items. If you have variations, then this is information you're definitely going to need. If you always build your items in the same exact way with the same exact flow and store format, that might not be information that you will need every time from your buying team. So I did include this. It's in the PowerPoint for your convenience. These are system-required vendor-filled responsibilities. You can review those if you'd like to. And a quick word about tomorrow. Tomorrow we're covering item setup in the new item grid. So if you do not use a data sync provider and you know that you're going to be building items manually, then you may not find attending tomorrow to be very helpful because we will not be going over manual item build. If you need assistance with manual item build, please email imahelp@searshc.com. I'm hoping to get something set up eventually, but we just haven't had the resources to create new material for a manual build webinar at this point. So again, if you need help with manual item build, please email imahelp. And if you give me 1 second, I'm going to put you guys in interactive talk mode.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
So that's all I have for today. If you have any questions, I'm going to be on the line for a bit. Otherwise, I hope you do have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.